Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Lazat. I'm the director of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. Welcome to our fall public lecture series tonight here at Innovation Works. I'm extremely grateful that you've all decided to spend your evening with us. So thank you so much for coming. Bree Watson is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University, very lately, and we're thrilled that they're here. Focusing on the multiple histories of information and how cultural heritage institutions, like libraries, archives, and museums, relate to marginalized communities through the practice of equitable cataloging and knowledge work. Watson was one of UBC Library's inaugural EDI Scholars-in-Residence, a recipient of a Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship, and a fellowship from the Maurice Young Centre for Applied Ethics. They are a two-time awardee of the Public Scholar Initiative and the Nancy DeLaurier Award from the Visual Resources Association. And it's really not fair to ask a new faculty member to come out and give a public lecture on like the 6th week they start working. But when we were considering, who we might invite for this lecture series on the theme of connecting research to the public good, Alyssa Santivani in particular was like, Bree, new person Bree, we need them. And I know that things have been hectic, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come out and speak with us tonight. So I will step aside, and we very much look forward to hearing from you.
One second, because I am using two devices at once here. Great, okay, it works. All right, then what is gonna happen today is I'm gonna talk for about 45 minutes, 40 minutes. I haven't actually timed this, so we're gonna see it. I have two timers. That's hopefully gonna keep me on track. And then I'll have questions, and so. But I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and to say that we're meeting today in the land of the Anishinaabe. Can we hear me, or should you be closer to this? Good.
Closer is good, yeah. Oh, awesome.
How's that? Much better? Great, thanks. All right, then we meet today in the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Changa'e nations, which are lands treated by the Two-Row Wampum Belt, the London Township Treaty, the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, and others. I was born in Indochina and in Albernac, near the borders of so-called Quebec. I'm a descendant of Scots, Irish, and English settlers, and as such, I'm an uninvited settler of all the nations that I've lived on. And as such, I am a beneficiary of the ongoing colonialism and genocide that Canada and the United States continue today. So I just want to take a moment to think about that, and to thank all the visible and invisible infrastructures that allow this meeting to take place. Dan and the Rothman organizers for inviting me, and the Labor of Katie for making this possible as well. My name is, as we said, was Bree Watson. I use they them pronouns. I'm queer. I'm non-binary, which and crit, which is to say disabled. I use hearing aids on the side and a cochlear implant on the other. So when it comes to questions, I'll probably tell you to yell at me, and don't feel good about that. That's great. I'm a new assistant professor at Western in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, and I'm glad to see some of my colleagues here, as well as some of the students from FIMS. And if you went to my job talk, some of this will be familiar, but hopefully there's enough new stuff and new perspective in here that you will enjoy yourself still. For those of you who don't know, my research and work and my activism falls really in two different areas. It falls into generally what I'll be teaching at FIMS, which is libraries and archive museums, special collections, cultural heritage institutions, and how they interact with marginalized communities in the ways that, that microphone's up there. Lost my track, and how they can better interact with marginalized communities and items and description and working with those communities. You can see up here the Homosaurus, which is a vocabulary meant for queer vocabulary work that archives and museums and libraries can use. And you can also see my second book, which is Ethics and Linked Data, which is about how you do this technically, which is much more of a boring book than my first book, which is this one right here. This is my other category of work, which is the history of sexuality and naming and how the construction of private and personal life. In other words, the labels that I was just using a second ago to describe myself, queer, non-binary, and so on. What are they? Where do they come from? How do they influence society? And how do they influence our own personal lives and our own personal images of ourselves? So hopefully you can start to see the two ways that these things are connected, and hopefully by the end of the talk you'll see some other ones. But I am going to turn to the talk itself. Thank you. The world divided into sheep and goats. This is a quote from a line in Alfred Kinsey's work. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. Not all things are black, nor all things white. It's a fundamental taxonomy that nature really deals with discrete categories. But just by a show of hands, who knows Kinsey and knows of Kinsey? Okay, great. So there'll be a little bit of review here, but I'm glad I didn't focus too much on explaining who Kinsey was. If you came of age of a certain time, you probably know your Kinsey number, which is this scale up here, which is to say 0 is exclusively heterosexual, 6 exclusively homosexual, and so on. But wouldn't that number then be a discrete category? Wouldn't that then be a goat or a sheep or something else? That's what I'm hoping to explore the tension between two here. The work here, what I'm to talk to you about today, is based on this book, which I've been working for a number of years now. I think it's probably about 7 or 8 years now, but I finally just gotten to the place where I can actually feel it coming together and can seal the whole point that was running through it all together. And so I'm going to touch on all three of these things here. The Kinsey, like Alfred Kinsey, the Kinseys, and the myth of the sexual revolution. So those are the three arcs of this talk. So I'll start all the way back at the beginning in the 17th and 18th century, and then we're going to take 300 years of scientific history throughout that. So it's going to be fast, and don't feel free to slow me down and tell me I need to slow down, because I do have a tendency to talk really fast when I get nervous like I am now. Second thing is there will be a picture of bugs for anybody who has ick in just a couple of minutes, as well as a brief mention of suicide in the talk. So those are the things that prepare you. I am going to turn now to this. So while there were lots of efforts to organize the natural world before Carl Linnaeus, while there were lots of efforts to organize the world of Carl Linnaeus, dating all the way back to Aristotle, by the 16th century, there was a variety of conflicting and complex standards, which mostly had the effect of spurring the creation of more conflicting standards and more things. Probably the creation of the absolutely and totally going to solve all the problems created by the previous systems. I promise, for real, this time, draft 2, final, this one. The honeybee, for example, was known to some authors in the 17th century as, and my high school Latin will definitely fail me in this moment, Apis pubescens thoraces abricio domine thrace, domine fresco pedibus postus glabrus unicis magna cletus. Or literally, the furry bee, grayish thorax, brownish abdomen, black legs, smooth with hair on both sides. It's not a bad, actually, description, but it's sort of a long thing when you're trying to write a scientific article. You can see where they're starting to run into problems. And indeed, one contemporary and little-known doctoral candidate reviewed 14 partial systems and 16 universal systems for his dissertation. There were 30 names just for the honeybee among all of these systems. You can imagine how hard it was to scientists to just understand what we were talking about, where, and how to reproduce science in a really effective way. This was, of course, before that doctoral candidate I just mentioned presented a totally new system as well. But to give him credit for this one, it actually did solve a lot of the problems of the previous ones, and for his troubles, he was raised to the nobility as Carl von Linné, which we know better as Linnaeus. And his model, which is called the binomial nomenclature system, arranges plants into 24 classes, or according to how many male and female parts they have with their stamens and pistils. You're probably familiar with this, with all the plants you probably learned about in high school biology and thereon. He also said there were several rules around how we can develop those names. Had to be in Latin or Greek, No compound words. You can't commemorate people who aren't associated with science, so no saints, no God. And only the right sort of people were allowed to assign names to plants. As he called it, the first step in wisdom is to know the things themselves. The notion consists in having a true idea of the objects are distinguished and known by appropriate names. Therefore, classification and name giving will be the foundation of our science. So taxonomy does two things that will sound familiar to anybody who has worked in cultural heritage institutions. It assigns names to things, and it puts them in a place on a shelf. And you can see the names here, and you can see the various shelves just lining the system. In other words, Linnaeus also has this joke here, which my high school Latin is not up for, which is the key to the sexual system is the title here. But I want to take the moment here to look at the chart because it's a good adage to repeat. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. This system of plants and the trees and branching diagrams makes sense to us because we were taught it, and we have Darwin intervening. We have the whole history of modern biology. It was not as clear to people around him at the time. For the people in the 16th century Europe, this sexualized vision of the natural world was controversial and actually rather disturbing departure from their worldview, both because it was sexual, but also because it separated humans from the natural world, which is not a thing any of the other systems had done before. It made humans special, and it removed them from the world around them. For Europeans at the time, they believed that humans and animals belonged to a great chain of being with everybody interconnected, everybody working together. There's accounts of trials in France. They tried the locusts for causing a plague. There's pigs who were put on trial in England. Very commonly happened throughout the medieval era because animals were seen as actually being able to respond to the legal system, which of course went all the way up to God and the angels and Jesus and all of that. But it was one complete chain of being. The triumph of the Linnaean system, which privileges sex and reproduction over other ways of being, was not inevitable. And so, but his approach for classifying living organisms caught on. And so our understanding of these living organisms as belonging to a tree or the network of a hierarchy is what we understand, but it's not how they would have seen it. The past is a different country. It's a foreign country. They do things differently there. So this intellectual lineage reveals how the construction of knowledge and scientific methods take place, how those methods and frameworks can transfer from one related fields, and how the impulse and imposition of categories on the natural world shapes it and also shapes ourselves. I'm going to talk into that a little bit more. This lovely image that I have here is an image from a crime scene. It's a plate from Systema Naturae, which is the book that popularized Linnaeus' system. It's the most influential book. It's his breakthrough moment. And the breakthrough moment for him was when a friend of his sent a collection of plants and roots from the Dutch East Indies, which is better known as Sri Lanka. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that taxonomy is based on and dependent upon colonialism and colonial extraction. There's no one without the other. And its method itself is fundamentally about observation, possession, hoarding, collecting, and pattern control. And it's not just because of that, it's not just an abstract system. It has a practice which has physical, actual objects. Is anybody familiar with these? They're called xylotechs. And what a xylotech was a way that you could go out and you collected the tree, you chop down a tree, and you make a book out of the tree itself. You collect all the moss that was around the tree, you collect the plants that was around it, and it even includes right here, I don't want to rest pushing a button here, that doesn't work. It even includes like a little thing, paper in the middle, where you can record your feelings about the tree and the mosses and the plants around it. So you're bringing like the classification of the natural world into your own little wooden library. There's also advances among other axes, including, I think, you might have to advance the slide. I'll probably just say next slide, please. Great. This advances are on the other axis, this is an example of seaweed. Here you have the plants themselves, the seaweed that's collected in little envelopes, and the description of the seaweed underneath it. So people are beginning to put the plant and the description of the plant together. The next step on this one is the next slide. it leads to these little perfect boxes. And this comes from a book that supposedly listed all of the algae in Britain. You could go out and collect all the algae, and I believe like the mushrooms, and you could collect everything. This was a way you could collect it all. You have a checklist to go through, and you had the whole world inside of your library or inside of your home. And I bring up all of these things because, next slide, the point is to illustrate the intellectual lineage between all of those collections, those boxes, looks a lot like, the next slide, looks a lot like all of these individual bugs, individually pinned, labeled, and collected. This is a collection of 5.5 million individually collected, labeled, and pinned gallops, but collected by, next slide, none other than Alfred Kinsey. I have to catch my notes up, great. Kinsey was a taxonomist and a biologist at Indiana University. And so when he was appointed in 1938, he was appointed to teach like a sex ed class for students that were married. It was like the way the university being like, this is the proper way to conduct your business after you're married. And after you graduate, we want to make sure we teach sexual hygiene at the time. Kinsey was like, okay, I'm going to teach the best class these students have ever had. I'm going to go out and collect all the primary sources, all the data. And unfortunately for him, this was 1938, and he was disturbed to learn firsthand there was no scientific data. There was no accounts. There was no good evidence. There was no good advice to give students that are coming to him with questions. Fortunately for him, however, this was 1938, and he was a studying WASP professor at the best time in the history of the world to be a WASP professor in the United States of America. And so he just decided to do it himself. He decided, I'm going to collect all the data himself. He ended up listening to starts with collecting the stories of his students to be like, what was your experience like? When did you first hear about masturbation or sex? And over the course of the rest of his life, he collects about 20,000 experiences of people, the intimate experiences of people. And it's sort of hard to undersell the massive impact that Kinsey and his work had on just North America and also the world wide. Next slide, please. But I'm going to try to show you this instead of telling you this. So I'm going to say a bunch of next slides. We've been given with a quiet, probably autistic, really reserved professor who liked bugs. Next slide. He published 2 books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And next slide. After that, he was on the front page of magazines or newspapers like one Cosmopolitan, which is not noted for his focus on statistics, biology, or even men. Next slide. He was Times Man of the Year, and the Gallup poll at the time of his death found that 1 out of every 2 American Canadians knew his name and his work, which is better than some United States presidents. Next slide, please. He gave the largest talk ever at UC Berkeley, and it's sort of like there's superstar academics, but then there's filling an entire football stadium with 10,000 people and then 20 or 30,000 people on the outside watching this event that's happening. This was a massive cultural phenomenon, both in science and in the media. Next slide. Dr. Samuel Seward called him Dr. Prometheus. He truly brought fire and light to the world. We looked upon him as a savior. He was our liberator. He was our Stonewall. Next slide. Go back. I just wanted to mention I did interview 2 people who were in this crowd that had actually talked to Kinsey, had actually heard Kinsey in this crowd. The first one was with his girlfriend at the time, and the feelings that Kinsey talk arose in him caused him to have such bad feelings that he went out and beat somebody up because he didn't want to feel the emotions that he was feeling at the time. He later came out as a gay man and spent the rest of his life being a poet in New York City through the AIDS crisis. A second man I talked to in this crowd had decided to kill himself when he arrived to this talk. And hearing Kinsey say the word homosexual turned his entire life around because for the first time he felt like, oh, I have a name for what's wrong with me. I can go find help. I can go find a community. I can go find somebody to talk to. And this talk really changed that, just having that label for himself. And on the next slide, please. On the other hand, this is sort of the darker side of this. It's like one thing if you find out really fast, if you begin looking into the sexual revolution, is that Christians, a lot of like hard right Christians who write in, for example, the Journal of Creation, really blame Kinsey for the sexual revolution, and more specifically the books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Female, as causing the sexual revolution. Quote, by convincing the public in the scientific world that what was once regarded as deviant behavior then, including adultery, fornication, homosexuality, sadomasochism, and pedophilia, was acceptable, Kinsey is honored by some and condemned by others, especially in view of the increasing evidence that the modern sexual revolution has aggravated many social problems and caused an enormous amount of misery and death. Okay, and so I began to ask myself, is this right? Did he cause the sexual revolution? And I thought this would be like a fun little investigation. I love reading these sort of like long historical quotes that go over several pages. I thought this would be like a really fun investigation into that question. And on next slide, I kept finding things that were inconsistent with the story that I understood it to be, the history that I had been taught as a historian, as somebody who had worked in this field. I kept finding sources that were telling me something different. On the next slide, this 1952 article by Max Lerner talks about the sexual revolution in America in the 1920s. And this is only one of the many articles that use this term, quote, sexual revolution or new morality or some variation of that. And so I began to become sort of obsessive about this. I was working at the Kinsey Institute at the time, and I was an archivist processing the collection of what was called the print media collection, which is 40,000 articles. It's 40 boxes of every single news article that mentions Kinsey or the books. And so I got to read Nebraska news articles from Paris, London. It's around the world, a really comprehensive collection. And they kept, when quoting Kinsey and the team, they kept quoting about the sexual revolution. The media was talking about the sexual revolution in the 40s and 50s, but Kinsey and the team were using this term sexual revolution to refer to the 1920s. Next slide. And I was also surprised to learn that the Kinsey Institute in the 1980s had embarked on a multi-year investigation of, is the sexual revolution happening on college campuses? And they interviewed 3,000 Americans to explore behavioral changes. And their research question is right here. Is there a sexual revolution occurring on campuses in America? Or is it simply a continuation of this long-term trend observed by Kinsey? Their findings, the next slide. They were hoping to find stuff like this, like this disappearance of Victorian values leads to a new age. This is 1966. Next slide twice, please. But instead, what they thought of the sex revolution is often called the myth, is new morality freedom or just a form of social anarchy. Next slide. Most of their subjects condemned extramarital sex, prostitution, and homosexuality, as well as casual sex. Next slide. Unmoored from relationship. The pill did not launch an avalanche of either premarital or extramarital sex, heterosexual activity. Non-heterosexual activity is a different story, but heterosexual activity is what they're focused on. They found that college students were not reporting any big changes from the earlier decades, nor did college students suddenly increase their rates of casual sex. Then changes in the 1960s and 70s were not more rapid than previous generations. And so what I began to do is to look at this term, the sexual revolution. I start pulling all these. So those are the articles that I mentioned. I found another 3,000. And I also pulled 12,600 academic articles, books, reports that mention these terms. And next slide. This is the actual, these are all the places that I begin looking for this data. And I've been doing this since 2020, and so it's ended up in 12,600 items, about 30 gigabytes, 500 to 600,000 pages. And what I found was this inconsistent use of the sexual revolution. All of these historians had different dates for what the sexual revolution was. Nobody could agree on it, and all of the newspaper articles were saying the sexual revolution happened in the 1920s. And so I'm now at the point of being like, the sexual revolution is a myth. And there are only one historian I've been able to find has actually noted this incongruity, but it's not been very widely reported, or I believe it's the next slide. Yes, one more click. Kinsey had little control over the volume's reception. The Indiana team began taking sex history during the late 1930s and completed the bulk of its interviews for the first volume during the mid-1940s. Next slide. Despite the author's reminders that the cohort were heavily represented in the reports around the turn of the century, readers repeatedly interpreted these volumes as snapshots of the present. The most important findings were buried under the popular impression that it referred primarily to contemporary Americans instead of Americans in the 1930s and 20s. And I'm hitting on this a lot because this is a big divergence from what we're usually told. Like the sexual revolution happened, the pill that realized sex, and then gay agenda starts spreading, and so on and so forth. And so in some ways, I'm actually at the point of being like, well, I think the Christian media, I think the Journal of Creation was right in that Kinsey did make the sexual revolution, but I think he created the 1920s, the sexual revolution, and the media created the 1960s sexual revolution. And there's a few other things that have led me to that. So that's Kinsey, and that is the mix of the sexual revolution. Now I'm going to talk about the Kinseys, which is the next slide. The Kinseys, and why I'm saying the Kinseys is because I mean the man, but I also mean the institution. The other researchers, the library, the archives from 1945 to the present day. And so I use this term, the Kinseys, as a system and an organization. Most of my dissertation work focused on the library specifically, which is up here. And on the next slide, I hopefully have the right one. Yes, great. I have a quote from Kinsey himself, which is, Kinsey donated his entire library, but then all of the profits from that wildly successful, best-selling academic textbook went to funding the library. It is a beautiful collection to work with. It has Michelangelos, it has Da Vinci's, it has like Renaissance statues, it has a huge collection of pornography, the largest in the world, they often say. But Kinsey said his mission to the library was to collect from a diversity of fields, biology, medicine, psychology, psychiatry, other scientists, literary sources, classics, modern fiction, from poetry, from art, from law, from religious literature, and many others. The name of the form of pottery is escaping my head. I believe it's in Chile. It's a form of like erotic pottery that is really well associated with the Incans. And to this day, it is very hard to get your hands on it because the Kinsey Institute has probably 90% of the world's collection because nobody was buying sex stuff in the 1940s. And so this was all dirt cheap stuff that Alfred Kinsey was able to collect. It's a wonderful collection. It's not very well used by many academics. And next slide, I do have a mention of one of the academics that used this. There's a chance you know Stephen Marcus, although you may not know what he's responsible for. On the next slide. In 1962, according to Marcus, he fell victim to a series of fortunate events. And while he was on tour at the Kinsey Institute Library, he just so happened to fall into a conversation with John Gagnon, which is a research associate at the Kinsey. Gagnon invited Marcus to meet the director. Marcus was like, oh, I'm just a lowly PhD student. Why am I meeting the director of the Institute? And Gebhard invited him in. He was going to be the first academic to come in and use the library. He published this book called The Other Victorians. And the result was sort of another one of those rare academic blockbusters. On the next slide. Is to say that it's been influential would probably be, again, underselling the case. It has that many editions. It has 1,500 libraries. The Kinsey Institute itself owns 50 copies of The Other Victorians, just to put this in scale, and hundreds and thousands of translations if you actually go across all the different versions of it. And so the idea that the Victorians are prudish, which many of us have heard before, that the Victorians are prudes and they suppress conversation about sexuality, is directly linked to this book in a way that I cannot underemphasize. The literature before Marcus was really talking about how hypocritical the Victorians were, and the Victorians actually loved sex when they talked a good game about it, and all the literature before that was saying that. And Marcus comes out with this book that says something completely different. And so what I started to do is I started looking at Marcus through the lens of the archive to try to understand him through the institute that he used. To do this, I requested every book he cites in the Other Victorians, and only the version that he had available to him at his time of visits. And I found multiple times the librarians had purposely skipped over books that were very relevant to his research, and that will be important in just a moment. I also examined the Institute's records on Marcus. So what was the Kinsey Institute librarian saying about him at the time? And to finally figure out how an archive could use a historian. And so when Marcus arrived in Bloomington as a brandly minted faculty in New York City, he was greeted with a full-fledged support of the institution. All the staff met him and gave him food and celebrated him being there. John Gagnon, who helped Marcus, set bearings in places where no bearings had been set before. He prevented me by knowing a hint or two from going headlong down blind alleys. Elizabeth Egan, the Institute's chief librarian responsible for overseeing a collection of hundreds of thousands of items, spent most of her days looking for tips from Marcus or looking for following up on leads or citations. Cornelia V. Christian, an art historian with a PhD and several other degrees besides that, spent her entire day explaining archives and archival practice to Marcus, who's supposedly a historian who knows about how institutes work, how archives work. Kinsey, co-author, spent multiple weeks with Marcus in order to impress upon him the importance of the collection. He also credits the director of the archive, the director of the Kinsey Institute at the time, Paul Gebhard, from spending hours with him, and Paul Gebhard's wife for typing up 60% of the book. And I don't know if you've ever been to an archive, but if you do know of one where like the director's wife will type up my academic research for me, please let me know. That would be fantastic, because it's not a normal treatment, to say in the least. And in this visit to the Institute, he was invited to use this, and he goes on to describe it. He calls it largely unused and unexplored. They decided it was time to open it up to the public and to certified scholars and other fields of study. It reads very much like an advertising brochure. And as it turns out, Marcus is not the only one. There are several other, I don't think I have a picture of this. There are several other books that use the Kinsey collection where the librarians held the hands of various academics going through the institution. And so this was very much like a public relations campaign after Alfred Kinsey himself had died. And so it's very much a relation of like they're trying to show the use of the collection. Very shortly after the publication of the book, they received a $3 million grant from the United States government to improve the access of this collection. That's one I was studying in my dissertation. But this is a very interesting thing. They're influencing the media in the same way that the archive is trying to through the historian. Next slide is just a picture of the Institute at the time. These are all the folks. That's Alfred Kinsey in the middle, and Paul Gebhard is right to the top of him. On the next slide, I'm just going to return back to the library.
Forward, back.
Forward. One more. Yes, great. In the 1970s, 80s, the Kinsey ran an information service, which is what you see up here. They fielded close to 2,000 information requests annually from around the world, and oral history of these two librarians telling their experience, their oral history of the Institute. They talked about how reporters got a hold of the phone number of the information service and called them at all hours of night of day. They received phone calls from Poland at 3 a.m. for all these reporters asking the Kinsey Institute to verify this. Can you please verify the citation? Can you please verify that homosexuals have X number of partners per year? And in each one of them, the Institute was allowed to assert their version of how the world worked and operated and looked, their version of how sexuality operated and looked. And that's not enough. This director of the Institute right here is June Reinsch, and she wrote a column right there, the Kinsey Institute New Report on Sex. This was very widely distributed. It appeared alongside Peanuts, Dilbert, Nancy, and Mamadou, very like well-known comics, and I'm sure you've seen them in your own newspapers. And so the Kinsey Institute had a very, very, very aware understanding of how the media worked and how they could use it. Then go to the next slide. Okay, so I have a couple of extra slides, but I feel like I've talked a lot, and I have some more slides that like sort of data or give examples of the things that I've just talked about. But to conclude here, these are the three things that I really want to bring forward with this book. It's the Alfred Kinsey, and the way that he understood sex and sexuality, the Kinseys, and the myth of the sexual revolution. Ashley, can you go like a few more slides forward until you see one that says seeing like a system? Keep going, keep going. Okay, and just keep clicking for a few. And so there you go, perfect. what I call this seeing like a system. And what I mean by that is that there's a system, sexologists have said, there are 3 ways of being. You can be gay, straight, or bisexual. And we take those terms as individuals, and we're like, okay, there are 3 ways of being. I have these 3 labels to describe the feelings inside of me. And so you are using the words of of the sexologists in my case, but perhaps other scientists. I would love to hear their perspectives on this. You're using these terms and framing your own life and your world around it. And then researchers are going out and studying that. People are organizing this data and reporting it. It gets reported in the media and on museum exhibits and in libraries. And then the communities themselves sort of respond and they're like, well, this term doesn't work for me anymore. I actually think I might be asexual. And then the researchers get the funding and go out and study asexual people. And it's sort of the self-completing loop, which is this idea that these things, if we're actually born this way, if we're born into this world with being gay, straight, bi, whatever, then why are these things influenced by the material conditions around us? And my assertion is that they're not really, and that the system, it's actually inside of us in some ways, and that the language that we're using to describe it is the only way we know how to describe. Because it's in those moments of vulnerability when we don't have the right word that we reach for the words in the systems. So that's where I'll leave it for right now for questions.
In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association held a vote by 60. Okay, thank you. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association held a vote, and if I'm not incorrect or correct, 62% voted that homosexuality was no longer a mental illness. And not long after, it was removed from the official literature of the American Psychiatric Association. But it took nearly 30 years for them to approve of gay marriage. Strange how these things take time to work their way through the official system. So you know more about this than I do. Could you perhaps talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The only other profession that beat the psychologists to being the first one to be like, we need to change this. We need to vote that homosexuality is no longer a mental illness. The librarians were the first professional organization to change status of homosexuality on the shelves. And then psychology, the psychiatrists and psychologists were influenced by that decision. And this is, I don't know if this will be a chapter in the book or if I want to take this for something else, but there's the way the systems of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is used to diagnose somebody with a mental illness. And there's this fascinating instance. Do you know about the asexuality incident with the most recent version of the DSM?
Oh, in 2013, not that one, but others, yeah.
So what happened was at the time, 2012, a drug company came out with something that was supposed to fix women's sexuality or make women horny, like in the same way Viagra made men horny. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but they developed this drug, and the clinical trials showed that it really didn't work that effectively. But what they did do is spend a lot of money trying to pathologize the idea of asexuality. And the idea already existed somewhat, but it was really brought to the forefront in the prior version of the DSM. And then the DSM-4, the asexuality community was able to intervene and say, no, if I am not attracted to people, that's not a problem. There's not anything wrong with me. And this was one of the very few times, I think, in the history of the DSM, and there's a new version happening right now, as you probably know, that the community was able to win over the labeling of themselves as being like broken or bad in some way. And so this sort of cycle was actually started by this thought about the DSM as like, well, if we can just rule it's not a mental illness, and it is, it's sort of, their categories are only as useful as the things they hold, right? And the categories are only defined by how well they capture everything around it. Linnaeus' system worked really well because it captured plants in a way that seemed to work for the way plants actually behave in the world. But they're not they're not the things they seem in the systems. And I think that's very true of the whole crisis with the DSM as well.
Are you in favor of neurodivergent, or?
I really don't know. I use the term neurodivergent for myself, but I don't know if I'd use the term, I don't know if it's a useful clinical term.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's also a very interesting discussion happening right now around people with autism and the DSM, as well as the ICD, the international version.
So a lot of Alfred Kinsey's work was done for the civil rights movement. So I was wondering if there was any type of research that he did in terms of like racial categorization within sexual experiences as well, or like interracial relationships. And then also follow-up would be that in the 1960s there was a sexual revolution, but also the civil rights movement. So I wonder if there was like a progressive train of thought that led both at the same time. Like intersectionality always affected that, but it became more of a term in recent times. But I was just like insights on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have the slide I want for this at all, to be honest. I'm just going to check. I have two different things here. Slide sorter. I don't have the slide I want, but so the reason I chose specifically in my dissertation work, and probably also prior, was that I was trained as a historian first. And so that was sort of my framework in coming into the library science profession. And in order to understand where do these labels come from, what's the whole arc of them, I wanted to do this dissertation. My dissertation was close to 1,300 pages all combined. The first 300 pages being this one you just saw here, and then the rest being the labels, where they come from. How do people in the modern day who use these labels for themselves feel about them? How do they use the system that has them in it? And how can we fix them in the future? And so that was the arc of my dissertation. I want to go for a bigger picture that would encompass like settler ideals, racial ideas, many other. My dissertation committee said no, that the project I was doing was already too big. It was, someone called it 3 dissertations in a trench coat. So that was the no I had received. The other thing was, they're not capturable by an archive. The Kinsey Institute is unique because these labels are the youngest labels, and there's mostly all in one institute, one archival visit, which is affordable on a doctoral scholar student, on the budget of a doctoral student. And so that's why I chose to limit to queer specifically. There's a fantastic book called The Gender Binary and the Invention of Race by this philosopher and historian in the States who, I can't remember what institute she worked at, but she basically retired just to write this book. And it's this phenomenal examination of like culture, science, literature of like the gender binary and race and how they co-construct each other and how they both come together at the same moment in time in history. And now that's Sally Horowitz, I may be Horowitz. Now that she's read it, I was like, okay, damn, I can't even do that. I really recommend it. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's even open access. It's a really, really fantastic examination of like these categories and as they tie to race and gender. Right there.
Yeah, thank you. This was wonderful. I do a lot of archival work, also kind of tying into the history of sexuality, but I hadn't thought in terms of like analyzing the library itself before. And I'm curious, I had never seen the phrase sex library before, and I'm curious if in preparing his materials and setting up what became the Institute, did Kinsey envision other kinds of sex libraries in the world? And obviously the Kinsey Institute is unique for so many reasons, but that's such a great description of an interdisciplinary fields approach to building a collection. But I'm curious what his thoughts were on sort of the process of library creation.
Yeah, Kinsey's, the reason I say very probably an autistic man, and Dan, there's a slide that looks like a stack of books and a chart. Like if you, keep going, like forward until you see a stack of books on the left. Then stop. There, that one. Okay, so Kinseys, before the Galwapster collection, the 5.5 million collection, that is the largest collection of insects in the world. That's the largest collection of a specific insect. That is the largest collection in any museum. It's in the American Natural History Museum. It's the largest collection of metadata in the world. And so this person was a totalizing hoarder, archivist sort of person. And so he, to this day, there's been not really much work done in Galwaps because he went from every hill between New York City and like deep rural Mexico and cataloged the variation of change in every single one of these bugs. And so that's where he starts from. And so he goes to like this sex research when he makes this pivot in life. This is not the only way that he collects his classical music collection is actually a huge, massive collection of classical music, unsurpassed by some actual music libraries in the world. And in his life, he liked to have the best collection of flowers in his garden, so he'd compete with his neighbors. He always wanted to be the best, or he'd be mad that he wasn't the best. And I do this thing constantly with Kinsey, where I'm just like, I don't want to make him this hero because he was an average man in this time, and he came with a lot of the problems in eugenics and race that many scientists did at the time. And it seems like he was really upset and hurt by this idea that people were struggling with sex, and they thought that they shouldn't have to struggle with sex in their identity. And he's like, it exists in the world, and so people should be free to do it. And then he spent the rest of his life, and it cost him probably many years of his life because he like threw himself into it. And I don't know if Kinsey could have conceptualized, this is me a long way of getting back to your answer, I don't know if he could have conceptualized another library, because he would have been, I want it all. I want to take it. And it went so far to the point of there's letters from the American Librarian of Congress at the time who collected, and this is thanks to Melissa Adler, work on Cruising the Catalog, collected the books that were illegal in America and shipped it to the Kinseys. So there's a private collection of the American libraries collecting books and sending to Kinsey. It seems also that the British Library gave him many books around sex and sexuality they didn't want anymore. And so it's sort of all ended up in Indiana, which is the worst place for it to be politically ever. And so that's sort of my answer. It's not like a very good satisfying one. It's that I don't think he would have liked the idea of another sex library. Oh, sorry, I forgot to, why I brought this whole slide up. This was what I did my doctoral work on. What you see here is this stack of books. They're massive books. They're probably about the size of that table is two of them. They're huge. And what you're looking at, all these volumes, these are their catalog records. If you go to the next slide, I think. Next one. This, so each one of the pages is this. It's a list of the catalog records. And if you go to the next slide, it's an actual individual catalog card. So in the 1970s, the Kinsey Library copied every single one of their catalog records in order to make an online catalog. This is the big grant they received from the US government after Marcus's book. And what this allowed me to do is to trace the conception of ideas. So this was the cutting edge collection, probably still one of the best in the world. But you can see these cross outs around ideas. And so they're taking Library of Congress terms and they're crossing them out and being like, no, we're going to do this term. We're going to go this way. And they work through this, and there's lots of things that come out of this, and my dissertation online, you can read it if you like. But these ideas that they're working to depathologize, but they're also in the 1970s working very hard to create is maybe too strong a word. They're working on some level to support an idea of gender and the way that men are and women are, as opposed from male and female. And John Money is very much the creation of so-called gender is very much wrapped up in this as well. And so this is sort of like what I was doing in my dissertation work.
Thanks for this. This is just wonderful and stimulating. It's got me wondering about, like, it was interesting that you talked about how it was librarians who started to recategorize homosexuality in the late 60s, and then it was the medical community kind of caught up with them. And do you know anything about the role of journalistic style guides in this? Like the New York Times has rules about and so the shift from Negro to Black to African American, I mean, that was, I don't know if you can say it was driven by activists, but a key mechanism was when newspapers said, okay, everybody, this is how we're going to use these terms. And so where would you put style guide, journalistic style guides, or have you thought about where they would fit in your system?
That's a great point. I've written an article on style guides, but I've never actually thought about how it would interact in this way. That's a really good point. I think the AP style guide is like massively influential in terms of the gay disease when it changed to AIDS. Like that's a big shift that happens in like just representation of what this disease is, but also representation of queer people putting a lot of pressure on them. And I hadn't thought about style guides as being, I really like that idea. I have to look into that a little bit more. Because it is really like newspapers themselves just pick a specific term and go with it. And the sexual revolution, that's why in the early on it's like sexual revolution, the new morality, the new way of being, those are all like roughly equivalent terms. But as the corporatization of the media increases, there's much more, we're all on the same language here. Thank you for that, that's a really interesting point.
Is there anybody else? Okay, maybe I'll just take us back to the beginning. So when you put up the scale at the beginning, 1 to 6, and you commented like, what are these if not more categories? Which I'm with you. But I was thinking about it, and I think and this is maybe a rookie information science question, so bear with me, but one thing that gives you is a notion of similarity among the categories that you don't have otherwise. So it gives you at least the idea that a 5 is more similar to a 4 than it is to a 1. And then in the Linnaean system, it gives you the idea that a lily is more similar to an iris than it is to an aster. And so what's the significance of that moving to categories that apparently have some kind of affinity or similarity to them?
Yeah, that is where like I am on where the so what of the book is also like Kinsey does say like he I didn't have the slides in here, but there's a wave of sexologists before him, and they're largely European, and they largely focus on, they're largely journalists, lawyers, judges, they're largely coming from that sort of like background. And they don't focus on the way people are, like what goes into what hole. They're focusing on like what's the interior mental state of the person. And the result is they come up with these massive lists of earning, Diogen, and they keep adding various, like as you do in German, like various prefixes and suffixes until you have, with Hirschfeld and person's name, so they have like dozens and dozens of titles for people. And of course the Nazis come along and then basically destroy German sexology at that moment. And Kinsey was definitely aware of this. The Institute for Sex Research was definitely named after the institute that the Nazis destroyed. There was a very clear, Kinsey's research methods look a lot like a certain German scientist's research methods. So he very much was in this aware of like the people who have gone before him, and the sexual behavior in human male does review them at length. He gives them credit. But he seems to be aware, like, okay, that's not the way to go, because it's just going to be a bunch of, I would use the term Tumblr sexualities, a bunch of like very niche various sexualities or labels, and nobody's going to really understand. And so he decides, like, okay, I'm just going to reduce things down to sex, so to speak. But like, I'm going to reduce down to like, who are you actually having sex with? The Kinsey would have been horrified at us choosing our own Kinsey number. He would have been like, no, only me as a man scientist who has done all this work, I can diagnose you with the category. You don't get to pick. Very similar to how Linnaeus was with plants as well. And so the idea of like, yes, there are roughly similar, And there's also the exclusions of his category. Like, he has a category called X, which is what we would probably refer to as asexual people that don't get put in the data at all because he doesn't know what to do with them. He also has these interesting choices for somebody in the 1940s and 50s of being like, when Christine Jorgensen, who's one of the most famous people who transitioned from being a man to a woman, American GI in the war and the transition very publicly, she comes to Indiana and everybody that comes to visit Kinsey gets interviewed. And he's like, well, she's a woman, so her data's in the woman book. He's just like, it's just the way that you interact with people. Very interesting, but yes, it does create these categories, and I'm not sure where that's a one about it yet. Thank you. Any questions? One more?
Thank you, Bree. My question's actually, I'm really intrigued when you were talking about Stephen Marcus and the work that he's doing at the library and the ways in which the Kinsey folk were providing him with information, but they were choosing the information that he was getting. I was really interested in the kind of curated notion or the curated version of Kinsey that was being put forward there. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how that maybe shaped Marcus's book.
Yeah, let me go to there's a bunch of things I didn't want to read because I felt like I was getting away from the point, but I'm glad you asked the question because that means I get to read a little bit more. Okay, so yes, it's not normal to have this experience when you go to an archive where librarians with professional master's degrees are spending their entire days curating to you and catering to you and giving you books, or having the director's wife type up your book. He was invited, yes, he talks about it's gone largely unused and unexplored. It's the opinion of the directors that now time had come to exploit the material. It's believed that the time had come to open up the heretofore locked doors of the Institute and extend the use of its immense resources to scholars from other fields of studies. This does not read like an academic textbook. This reads like an ad for the Kinsey Institute Library and Archive. And so the Kinsey Institute is going through this crisis of after the death of Kinsey. They're like, we don't have as much money coming in because of various political issues with the female volume. Kinsey said that women had sex, and the United States Congress did not like that and withdrew his funding. That's a whole other story altogether. But because of that choice that Kinsey made, the library sort of goes through this crisis period after he dies. He dies very suddenly from really overwork. And so Paul Gebhard was really the person who steered through this period of crisis. Some of the ways that he decided to make the Institute more relevant was to be like, okay, we're going to open up the data to the researchers. He received some money from the National Institutes of Mental Health to do that. And that actually carries the library just from the verge of bankruptcy. But he never really wanted to open up all the way to the Institute. Throughout his tenure, he proceeded with extreme caution, sometimes expressing his fear that outside scholars could easily damage the reputation of the Institute if they allowed too much latitude. And so what he settles on is okay, we're going to partner with, I believe it's Basic Books, it's the publisher of Marcus's book, which is a relatively highbrow, popular, but mostly academic publisher. And we're going to put out these books, The Other Victorians, Food and Sex, Sex and History. And so he has a culinary historian comes, and here's all the recipes, the Institute. And so he goes to that. And I had one more quote here, I think. So finally it seems that Marcus was much more controlled by library staff than even he realized himself. Although The Other Victorians is incredibly sparse on footnotes, almost no citations in the entire book, he does cite a couple of works that most time he fancies himself as being out in the field alone, exploring a field that had never been settled, learning a new language, being alone in an area when almost none had ever been before. One of the chief difficulties attached to this kind of study has to do with the almost total absence of any kind of serious or relatable previous work. There was, in fact, many authors who had published just before him that had done sort of critical looks to the Victorian era, but his book really it partially buys into the media narrative, it partially buys into people's belief about Victorians, and it really just picks up from there. So much so that historians have had to spend probably close to 3 decades being to the Victorians did like sex, so we have to slowly self-correct. The only person who did more damage to the history of sex was probably Foucault, is what I would probably argue.
So I have a quick question, actually. So you mentioned that he was very much a man of collections, and I'm wondering about the people behind the scenes, if he collected his librarians, if you will, who they are, if we know much about them, how he selected them, and if you think it was their input that ended up influencing a lot of what we had later. As you mentioned, they curated quite a bit of the archive of what was released.
Yes, I'm glad you answered this question. This is just on the outside of, this is where like it gets more into media studies. My first book was about how porn became bad, but I'm looking at books and text and like that sort of window. And because I don't have the skill to be able to listen to long films and like understand film history. Once you get into film history, it gets really interesting because there is no porn collection except the Kinsey Institute. And the Kinsey Institute only collected porn films from 2 Indiana dealers, both who were incredibly homophobic and had no queer sex films. And so that very much creates a narrative of all these scholars, and there's a scholarship for PhD students to come to Indiana to look at the film collection. All these film scholars are coming, but that is the one collection of film. There's some various other smaller collections now. There's one in Toronto now, but just now, like 40 years later, are those getting established. And so that really sets the stage in film theory and film criticism and dealing with sexuality. The other thing is the Kinsey Institute itself also had like this retainer thing where they would like be like, this artist, we like their work. They've given all of our stuff to us when they die. And so we're going to be like, go to Europe, take a vacation, buy some stuff for us. And so there's a few well-known artists who Anthony Silvestri is the academic who's worked on these artists. I can't remember the name of there's a rather well-known filmographer who goes to Europe and just buys statues, I think he bought like 6 columns off a monastery that was closing in France and shipped them to the United States that are now in the Kinsey collection. And so they have this weird thing because they have so much money for an institute that really the whole thing was written that all the profits went to improving the collection. So they just had money to burn throughout probably up until the early 60s. And so they just collected almost fantastically, almost overwhelmingly. And these things exist like, oh, this entire field is now influenced because of Kinsey.
Thank you. I just had a really quick question about maybe Kinsey himself. I was wondering if you knew, like, if he intended for his work to become like so popular in society at large, and maybe like if he didn't know when he decided to like lean into that and like the popularization of his work. I'd like to hear more about that if you don't mind. Thanks.
I would love to. I'm seeing if I have anything here. Can you go until you see a chart on the screen, like an engram? Keep going, keep going, keep going. Ignore all that. Okay, right there. First go to the next slide first, and then we'll come back to that one. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay. What you see here, these are the interviews that they did, the actual notes they took on a card to be like, this person is gay. It's meant to be completely indecipherable. You can't understand it. But they asked, in an hour-long interview, they had 6,000 data points coming out of this. And so Kinsey has, all of this data. They are up above there is a Hollerith machine, which is a card counting machine. They hire lots of people to punch all of these cards. And this is the first really big data project that's not the US military getting sources for bombs. So this is the very first big data project that turned the lens on individual people's private lives. And they had the cards up here, those punch cards, and there's the interpretation. And these are all lovely pictures, especially as a historian to go and like look at them. But they all existed before the book came out, which is like, you seem to be pretty aware that this was going to blow up. And there's an open question in Kinsey Institute and sex history whether or not Kinsey himself was knowing that this book was going to touch off. But it seems to me like this was not a new academic. He knew how to get grants. He knew how to like write stuff, and he'd had award-winning books before. This pivot into something that's really hot button seems to me that he knew what he was doing it, and he was playing the media in a very strong way. When I was an I think I can say this. Let me think about this for a second. Yes, I can say this. When I was an archivist at the Kinsey Institute, we were all giving like sort of media training, what we can and can't say, as somebody who is aware of like stuff that's in the collection. And so I can talk about like, I was an archivist and I one of the first things I had to catalog was the dildo, and like the dildo was melting in front of me because it was a bad material that was like dissolving literally in front of me. And so I can say that, but I can't say like some other aspects of like what the institution knows about the institution. It gets very weird. But it seems to me very much from what I can say and what I've done in the research that Kinsey was aware that it was going to blow up, and he had to spend a lot of time convincing the publisher to print extra because it sold out immediately once the media got a hold of it. And once the second book came out, he did this thing with the media because he already knew it was going to be a success, where reporters came, but they could only see the data and write their articles as long as they agreed to be interviewed with the sex history, and as long as they agreed to give that data to the Kinsey, and as long as they agreed not to publish until a certain day, the whole agreement. But this whole thing of like, okay, these reporters come and then they sit for the sex interview. So they see the they understand it. They've already bought into the system by the time they get to whatever article they're reporting. So they've been co-opted into sort of like the description of there's a fascinating, I think it might be the Cosmopolitan article. There's one in Ebony as well of women reporters who are going to sit for Kinsey, like they're talking about like all the things that the men are doing while they're taking down their data. It's really interesting. If you follow with me, I think I could probably find a copy of it for you. Any other questions?
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you.
We're very glad to have you here, Professor. And thank you all so much for coming this evening. Again, we really appreciate it, and hope to see you again in the future. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.